Welcome to the deep dive for this week. Don't forget to visit the website at deepdiveau.net. Check out our socials and Patreon page at the Deep Dive AU. Subscribe via your favourite podcast app or like and subscribe at our YouTube page at the Deep Dive AU.
The Deep Dive podcast mugs are now available for purchase and are currently on sale. Just go to our merchandise page at deepdiveau.net to purchase one. Don't miss out on this opportunity to grab one for yourself or as a thoughtful gift for a fellow podcast enthusiast.
This is the Deep Dive Podcast. And here is your host, Michael Coles.
Peta Hooke is a passionate disability advocate who loves a chat. Peta lives in Melbourne and has a lifelong disability of cerebral palsy. She is the creator and host of the I Can't Stand podcast, a weekly podcast answering questions and interviewing fellow disabled people about life when you have a disability. Peta has an educational background in business, accessible tourism, and access inclusion. She is also a very proud board member of the Australian charity Friend in Me. Peta Hooke, welcome to the Deep Dive.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so what motivated you to start the I Can't Stand podcast, which is an excellent podcast, actually?
Thank you. Well, the I Can't Stand podcast was a thing that came out of COVID, like many of us. I pivoted. I was basically sick of going to a local cafe and being asked by a stranger, what happened to you? So that's why I thought I should start a podcast. Because it just didn't feel efficient to be educating a person one by one. And I know for some people with disabilities, they're not comfortable at disclosing things with strangers, which was very valid. So I felt like that there was a gap in the market, and I absolutely love what I do.
Okay, so how has hosting the podcast influenced your personal journey?
Well, first and foremost, it's allowed me to connect with the disability community. Prior to the podcast, I had no connection really with the disability community whatsoever. It's been really lovely and empowering to be part of such a beautiful community. I've met so many beautiful people through interviewing them on the podcast, and I feel I understand disability better, and I hope that's reflected in my advocacy work now and going forward.
Okay, so what challenges have you encountered in podcasting due to your disability, and how have you addressed them?
Good question. I've never been asked that before. Because I have cerebral palsy, my speech is affected. So you might be able to hear I get really breathy very quickly. I struggle to keep up with my brain and my speech. So I have to really make sure that I speak slower than what I'm inclined to do. So often I have to edit out lots and lots of breaths when I'm interviewing people on the podcast. But first and foremost, and when I'm really tired, my articulation isn't as good.
Okay, so that's really important to actually sort of realise. So how can you discuss the importance of representation and visibility for individuals with cerebral palsy in the media?
Well, first and foremost, I think everybody with a disability needs better representation in the media, not just people with cerebral palsy. I'm very conscious that I don't just interview people with cerebral palsy on the podcast. What I've realised, despite what sort of disabilities we have, many of us have similar experiences, and it just highlights the ableism that it is within our community and how much education is needed. So I think all representation of all disabilities is so needed, so valid. Let's hurry up and get on with it, everyone.
Exactly. The more voices out there, the better. So
Absolutely.
How do you select topics and guests to ensure diverse perspectives on living with a disability?
I don't think I've successfully gained a balance in that, Michael, if I'm being really honest. I find it, I really try to make sure that I have diverse voices on the podcast, but often because I'm a one-woman band, I do everything myself, like you do with this podcast, I know, Michael. It can be really hard to keep up with the need for content every week. So sometimes I feel like topics can be repeated a little bit. However, as we say, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. If you've met one person with cerebral palsy, you've met one person with cerebral palsy. Each of our experiences are similar, but also can be different. And I hope that I've been able to not only gain diverse voices with different disabilities, but people who live in both Australia and globally.
Okay, so what feedback have you received from listeners and how has that shaped your content?
So, working for myself alone, I really do miss the feedback that a workplace used to provide me. Luckily, I'm very self-motivated. So, to be honest, I don't get a huge amount of feedback anymore. I had some great constructive feedback when I started the podcast that was very helpful because I was very green and probably didn't know really what I was doing. But I'm very lucky now to have a very supportive community, and I hope to grow that in the future.
Okay, so how do you balance sharing personal stories with maintaining privacy in your podcast? I think that's very important to know.
Yeah, well, to be honest, this has been a very big challenge for me because I'm inherently very private. I don't really show my life very much, particularly on social media. As I say, I used to feel pressure. I would get messages from people and say, why don't you show more of your life? Like, what did you do on the weekend? Where did you go for lunch? Who did you see of your friends? And I just found that to be really uncomfortable. It's not a natural thing for me to meet a friend for lunch and say, hey, can we take a photo? And that's not why people follow me. They follow me to feel seen, understood, and also educated about what it's like to live with a disability.
Okay, so what role does community engagement play in the success of I Can't Stand podcast?
Well, I mean, I know that I'm not one of the most listened to podcasts every week. I've never been in the charts or anything like that, but I have a very small, dedicated community that are very supportive, and I wouldn't do it if I didn't have them. I do the podcast because of my community, and I wouldn't still be doing this if I didn't have them.
Okay, so how do you handle discussions about sensitive or challenging subjects on your podcast?
First and foremost, like you've done for me today, Michael, I think it's very important to send questions first to show what I intend to ask the guests so they know what direction I'm hoping to lead the conversation in, and they feel informed and they feel understood, they feel safe. They have the opportunity to say, you know what, I'm not comfortable with that question. Can we cut it? And I'm always like, of course. My biggest concern is always to make sure my guest feels confident and comfortable in their answers and in the whole experience of the podcast.
So, how do you handle discussions about sensitive or challenging subjects on your podcast?
So, I always gain their permission to ask certain questions, and they also have the opportunity after the podcast is recorded to say, you know what, I reflected on what I've said. Can that conversation just stay between us? And I'll always factor in their needs first and their wants first. They're my number one priority. So I will cut anything that my guest feels appropriate, and I always send them the edit before it's published.
Okay, so what advice would you give to others with a disability interested in starting their own podcast?
I would say, first and foremost, do it. If you have a passion for podcasting, it's the best thing that I've done. I love doing this. I love listening to other people's stories. That's fundamentally why I love doing what I do. I just find people endlessly fascinating. It is important to point out that it is a challenging industry, particularly if you're doing it by yourself. Being independent is a massive challenge. Week by week comes around very quickly. I feel like it's Tuesday every second day, sometimes because that's the day of my episode publication. But, you know, if you're passionate about doing it, definitely start. There are always people out there like you or myself that you can get in contact with to see whether they might be able to give you any advice, and become really connected to the podcasting community because they're really helpful when you've had a really bad day editing, because sometimes edits are just so challenging.
So, how do you ensure your podcast is accessible to a wide audience, including those with disabilities?
The podcast is on all major podcasting platforms, and I always provide a transcript for every episode. that I produce, so it's easily accessible on my website. So therefore, regardless if you prefer to listen or you prefer to read at your own pace, you're able to do that.
Okay, so can you share a memorable moment from your podcast or episode that had a significant impact on you?
Overall, I don't think there's one. I think every week I'm reminded about how awesome disabled people are and how accomplished we are in our own lives. It's allowed me to become more motivated in what I do, more driven in my career, and realize that anything is possible. I'm surrounded by similar people just like myself. I've realized that I'm not extraordinary. I'm not different. Many of my quirks I thought was a Peta thing. It's not actually, it's a cerebral palsy thing. Many of us have similar outlooks on life, and I feel like all disabled people are just awesome, really. They've had a massive impact on me.
Yeah, they're fantastic, aren't they? So, how do you stay informed about developments in disability advocacy to keep your content a little bit relevant?
So I have alerts on my computer that give me the latest disability-related stories. And I'm also very connected on social media with other disabled disability advocates. So basically, it's just staying informed, staying in touch, and always asking silly questions, because there's no such thing as a silly question.
There's no such thing as a silly question at all. So, what future topics and guests do you actually have planned for the podcast, or are they do they actually contact you, or do you contact them for interviews?
It's a bit of a mix. I've just had one suggestion from a listener. They'd like me to do a deep dive on the Disability Discrimination Act and how that impacts our lives. So I hope to do that in 2020. But really, often it's just me being nosy on Instagram and thinking, my God, that person has an amazing story. I wonder if they'd feel comfortable to share it on the podcast.
Yeah, and I think the more stories we actually share, the better it is.
I agree.
So, how has podcasting enriched your understanding of the broader disability community?
It's fundamentally changed me, actually. One of my friends rang me after I launched the podcast a few weeks afterwards and was quite shocked by how much I spoke about my disability, because I never used to do it in our personal life because there was no opportunity for me to do it because I was the only disabled person in my social group. So the podcast has really enabled me to better understand myself, better understand disabled people, and I've still got a lot to learn. I know that, but I hope it's allowed me to have a more full viewpoint of where the disability community is and how the non-disability community can help support and better understand us.
Okay, so, and one final question we ask all our guests here on the Deep Dive podcast. If there's one piece of advice in 30 seconds or less, what would that be?
I would say my one bit of advice that leads me every day, I think it's important to acknowledge that I'm a very privileged person. I know that. I know I'm very lucky, and other people's experiences might not reflect my own. So I'm always hesitant to give general advice because I don't know the context of what that person is living in. However, I feel it's fundamental for me to always try and look on the bright side and to push through challenges, because I've only got this life as far as I know, and I want to make the absolute most of it that I possibly can. So every morning I wake up and think, right, what are we going to do today? How are we going to rock today?
And on that note, Peta Hooke, thank you so much for being on the Deep Dive podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
For more information and to subscribe to the podcast, go to www.icanstandpodcast.com or go to her Instagram page at Peta Hooke.